I told you that a single promise could literally shape the destiny of an entire nation for thousands of years? Well, that's the incredible power of what we call the Davidic covenant. It's an amazing story about a king, his kingdom, and a promise so big, its echoes are still felt today. So let's get into it.
It's a question that has driven pretty much every great leader, artist, and innovator throughout history. And you might be surprised to learn that a really powerful answer comes from the story of an ancient warrior king. A guy who had a simple, noble plan. He just wanted to build a house for his God.
Okay, so our story kicks off with King David, and you have to picture him here. He's at the absolute peak of his power. He's beaten all his enemies, the kingdom is at peace for once, and like any great leader, he starts thinking about his next big project.
So David's sitting in his own palace, this beautiful place made of cedar, and it hits him that the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's actual presence, is still just sitting in a tent. And that just doesn't feel right to him. So he decides he's going to build a magnificent permanent temple, a truly worthy house for God.
But this is where the story takes an extraordinary turn. God sends a message back through the prophet Nathan, and the message is a simple, straight-out no. God isn't angry, but he completely rejects David's plan, because he is about to reveal a plan that is infinitely bigger. God basically says, David, you're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house.
And right here, it all comes down to a crucial play on words. See, when David said house, he meant a physical building, stone and wood. But when God says house, he means something totally different. He's talking about a royal dynasty, a family, a continuous line of kings that will carry David's name into the future, a legacy made of people, not of bricks and mortar.
This right here, this is the very heart of the covenant. And what's wild is that it's not a deal based on David's good behavior. It's an unconditional, permanent promise. God guarantees that David's dynasty, his throne, will last forever. And this becomes a massive cornerstone of theology, because for many, this ancient promise finds its ultimate fulfillment in a future king descended from David, Jesus Christ.
So a divine promise of an eternal kingdom, that's a powerful thing. But how do you actually make that a reality when you're surrounded by enemies? Well, for David, the answer was pretty clear. Through a series of absolutely brutal and relentless military campaigns to secure the borders of his growing kingdom.
With this promise from God fueling him, David just gets to work, systematically taking down the surrounding nations. The Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites. One by one, all these regional powers fell and became part of his expanding empire. This wasn't just random fighting, it was a masterclass in consolidating power.
And we're not talking about minor skirmishes here. To give you a sense of the scale, in just one battle, in a place called the Valley of Salt, David's army defeated 18,000 enemy soldiers. That's not just a win, that is a decisive, total victory.
And right in the middle of these accounts, we find this really vivid and honestly brutal detail. When David's army captured enemy war horses, they would hamstring them. Now, why would they do that? Well, two reasons. First, it completely neutralized the enemy's most powerful weapon, their chariots. But second, it was an act of obedience, a way of showing that they were relying on God for victory, not on the strength of their cavalry.
Not every conflict started on the battlefield. When the Ammonite king died, David sent a delegation to his son to offer his condolences, standard diplomatic stuff. But the new king's advisors were paranoid and convinced them they were spies. So he seizes David's men, shaves off half of each man's beard, and cuts their robes off at the waist, leaving them totally exposed. In that culture, a man's beard was his dignity. This was a deep public humiliation, an insult so bad that war was pretty much the only option left.
But David was so much more than just a brilliant military commander. After all the fighting and all the bloodshed, the story takes this surprising turn and reveals a completely different side of the king's character, his capacity for real kindness and integrity.
Now, to really feel the weight of what happens next, you have to understand the ruthless politics of that time. When a new king took over, the standard move was to systematically hunt down and execute every single member of the old royal family. It was brutal, yeah, but it was practical. It's how you got rid of any future rivals.
So try to imagine you're this guy, Mephibosheth. You're the grandson of King Saul, David's predecessor and his biggest enemy. One day, the king's guards show up and summon you to the palace. What are you thinking? You're expecting the worst, right? You're expecting to be executed. But David isn't there to get rid of a threat. He's there to honor a promise he made years and years ago to his best friend, Saul's son, Jonathan.
And what David does next is just incredible. It tells you everything about his character. He doesn't just pardon Mephibosheth, he completely restores him. First, he gives him back all the land that belonged to his grandfather, King Saul. Then he assigns a servant to manage it all for him. And the craziest part, he gives Mephibosheth a permanent seat at the royal table to eat with him like one of his own sons.
So what we get is this incredibly complex portrait of a leader. On the one hand, a brilliant and sometimes ruthless military commander, but on the other, a man of deep personal integrity who keeps his promises, even when it would have been way easier and politically safer not to.
And the narrative just keeps coming back to this one central point. It ties all of David's success on earth, his military wins, his secure kingdom, his fame, directly back to that divine promise he received. His power wasn't just his own, it was the covenant being fulfilled.
Of course, David's physical kingdom did eventually fall apart, just like all earthly empires do. But the promise was for an eternal house, an everlasting throne. And that leaves us with a pretty profound question. In a world where everything seems to fade away, what does it even mean for a promise, for a legacy, to be truly eternal? And what could that possibly look like for us today?